Welcome to this special Capclave edition of Fast Forward. I'm here with our guest, Michael Dirda, Pulitzer Prize winning reviewer, essayist, and book author. Michael, welcome to Fast Forward.
Pleasure to be here, Tom.
And it's a pleasure to have you back. It's been entirely too many years since the last time we talked. And let's catch up a little bit. Last time we talked, you had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1993 for your essays and commentary and reviews in the Washington Post. You continued for a number of years as an editor of Book World, and then your life evolved.
Well, as some people may know, the Post started offering a series of buyouts. I didn't know it was going to be a series at the time, but the first one came along about 8 years ago. And I was the youngest person eligible at the paper to accept the buyout if I wanted to. There was no obligation. And I decided I would because I wanted to stop being an editor, which I did 3 days a week, and to write full time. My wife, who had been working part-time because of our children, had gone back to work at the National Gallery of Art. She's an art conservator there, a paper conservator. And so she'd found the job that she wanted to stay with for the rest of her working life. And I thought this was an opportunity for me to do some other things besides work at the book section. So I think since 2000, I've written half a dozen books of essays, and try to keep busy. Besides, I do have a contract with the Post to write a weekly review on Thursdays, and I write pretty often for the New York Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement. I do a monthly column about neglected books and books from around the world for the online Barnes & Noble Review. I do a kind of a blog for the American Scholar. Basically, I'll write anything at all for anybody for a dime or two. And I live by my pen, and I just write about books.
You know, I've been reading the American Scholar blogs, and I find them absolutely fascinating. You seem very relaxed and willing to discuss a broad range of subjects on that particular forum. You seem quite comfortable there. It's not some of the other stuff in the past seemed a little more structured because it had to achieve a specific goal, especially your reviews in the Post.
Well, the Post, when you're reviewing a book, you have to tamp yourself down. It's the book that matters, or the subject of the book. And so I don't really allow myself to become a dominating presence. But when I write personal essays about reading or books or book collecting, then it's different. And I work hard to achieve a tone of nonchalance. I want them the pieces to sound as if I wrote them in 15 minutes. So far as I can tell, people say that they come off that way. But they have a different aim. And I've been doing a lot of such personal pieces. Over the years, I used to do them for the Washington Post once a month. Did a column called Readings many years ago. And,
I remember them. I used to love reading them.
There's a collection called Readings of about a third of them. And then I did an autobiography, a memoir of sorts, called An Open Book. And that has something of the same tone. But occasionally I write about fairly demanding books, and that's harder to be sort of easygoing and nonchalant about.
You did one book a few years ago called Classics for Pleasure, which kind of had elements in it in terms of the way you approached it and the books you discussed, as you do with your Barnes & Noble column, in terms of books that are less in the forefront, not obscure, but less in the forefront of popular culture than they were in the past.
Well, Classics for Pleasure actually got started when the editor of what was then Harcourt Brace asked me if I would do an updated version of the Lifetime Reading Plan by Clifton Fadiman. If you know this memoir I wrote, I happened to essentially steal a copy of the Lifetime Reading Plan and used it to guide my youthful book choices. And this guy, Andre Bernard, he's now the vice president of the Guggenheim Foundation. He had worked with Fadiman when he was a very young man at the Book of the Month Club. But I said I didn't want to do that. I would rather do a kind of beyond the Lifetime Reading Plan book. So Classics for Pleasure evolved out of that. I wanted to write about the kind of really books that had influenced us, that were important to us, but that were sometimes overlooked, or certainly hadn't been covered by Fadiman back 40 or 50 years ago. So instead of writing about Shakespeare, I would write about John Webster. Instead of writing about Homer, I wrote about Sappho, people who had been neglected, in my view. I mean, that's been the whole goal of my whole career as a literary journalist. It's to urge people to read beyond the bestseller list, to explore new forms, new genres, to go back to the great books of the past or the neglected books of the past, because they will often speak to you in very powerful ways. And I do think that people sometimes are fairly narrow in their choices of books. We have to be part of our own time. We have to become involved in the literature of our time. But it's important to have some sense of what's come before, so that you know whether a new book is an advance or it's a repetition or of something else that's happened long ago. I just wanted to urge people to read all sorts of things, because there's a lot of different kinds of pleasure out there.
Well, you came to the Post, if I remember reading correctly. You came to the Post and started writing reviews primarily because one of the things you saw was that there was not a regular examination of science fiction in terms of the book reviews.
Well, when I got to the Post, fairly soon after I got there, I started a regular science fiction and fantasy column. A.J. Budrys used to write an occasional one, but he was offered a job at the Chicago Sun-Times to do a regular column, and he could no longer write for us as a result. At that point, I'd read a lot of science fiction as a boy and a teenager, but I'd been in graduate school, I'd done other things. It had been a long time since I'd kept up with the field. But I did happen to know one prominent science fiction writer. I went to graduate school at Cornell, and she was teaching at Binghamton. She'd come up to parties there, and so I met Joanna Russ, and she and I became friends. And so when I had the chance to start this column, I wrote to Joanna and said, who should I read? Who should get caught up get caught up in things? What classics have I missed? Who are the critics of science fiction? So we exchanged, a good half dozen letters before the column started, and then I essentially tried to ask all the major figures in the field to write for me, and some that worked out well. Would often ask them to write about things other than science fiction. So Tom Dish would write about poetry. Peter Straub would write about jazz. I didn't keep them restricted to any particular genre.
You're the one who had Elizabeth Hand start writing reviews.
Long ago.
Yeah.
And there were certain. I mean, for when I was actively overseeing the column, I did try to get a large variety of people, and so I kept trying new folks. But eventually, there was a kind of natural settling on half a dozen or so reliable people, and they would be used more often than others. But I'm pleased. I got Ted Theodore Sturgeon to review a book long ago, and that was a lot of fun.
You have because of two things. First of all, because a lot of your science fiction reading was done as an adult rather than growing up in terms of much of the canon, as we would call it. And because you continue to read, I know that you still review Terry Pratchett's work when it comes out.
Well, I try to review at least a half a dozen books of fantasy, science fiction each year, some probably more. But I can't just do that. I mean, I have a lot of different interests, so I write about literary books and biography and intellectual history a lot. But I do look out for people who seem to be interesting or I think might appeal to a more general audience. Some of the ongoing series where you have to actually have the background in science fiction in order to appreciate them. Those won't work so well for a general audience. But you have a short story writer like Maureen McHugh, I think, who's just a wonderful writer, and the world should be aware of that.
Have you seen, because you have this perspective, 25 years active in the Post, and you're still an avid reader? I mean, I don't think I know anybody who's
30.
Have you seen any trend progression? The years keep adding up. Yes, they do.
I started in '78 there.
So do you see, have you seen, is there anything you can identify as a change in the way, in the style of writing that goes through the genre, or is it very idiosyncratic depending on the individual authors in terms of the writing style, the things that seem to appear more often or with regularity within the genre itself as it's published?
Well, I think that you've seen an evolution where, it's the ambitious writers of a certain sort have become much more literary. They can count on people being familiar with literary tropes, whereas perhaps in the 50s, where it was very much still a pulp-oriented genre, you couldn't expect that sophistication. The New Wave is responsible for a lot of that. But you still have very entertaining, fast-moving, writers of hard SF or that are or fantasies of Tolkien-esque nature. But what struck me, and I remember writing an essay about this in 1980 for The Nation. They called it the genre ghetto. I proposed that in the coming years, the rising generation of writers would take their inspiration from genre literature rather than from mainstream realistic fiction. That they would turn, not, just as, well, we rebel against our parents and we look to our uncles and our aunts for our models, and in the same way, I think that's how literary history moves. So that you now have figures like Cormac McCarthy, who's essentially, writes Westerns, or, Michael Chabon, or any number of people who have come at literature and have become mainstream, prize-winning, revered novelists, and yet their roots are very much in what we think of as genre fiction. And those boundaries are breaking down, as Gary Wolfe has been saying in the evaporating genres. The barriers between high and low and between pulp and not are no longer as rigid as they once were. And I think this is a good thing. Literature should take its inspiration from wherever it can find it.
What impact, I'm talking to a man who has more books than he has bookshelves, and you have a lot of bookshelves. There are some people that would say you could do a reality TV show just walking through your house trying to figure out everything you had on the floor, on the walls, next to the walls, on the shelves, on a table.
You've been in my house.
You've talked about it vividly in several essays.
Yeah, I talk about it a lot because my wife is always after me, so it's never far from my mind.
And you have an absolute love. It's evident in how you write, to the feel of a book in the hand and the ability to walk through pages at your own pace and at your own time. Do you see the era of electronic publishing that has just exploded over the last 5-10 years, now that the mechanisms in which to actually acquire electronic editions are much more prevalent? Has it changed the way we experience literature and storytelling as opposed to that big chunk of pulp paper with that hardbound cover that we carried around with us?
Well, I still have never used an e-reader. I think of the book as an artifact as well as a text conveyor. If you just want text, sure, screens will do that. But I think there's an extra dimension to the kinds of books we read. You read Raymond Chandler mysteries, you want a leggy blonde on the cover of a cheap paperback. You read Henry James, you want a stately edition. There's something about the book itself as a medium that appeals to me. The one aspect of screens that does seem really worthwhile is the capability of enlarging the type as our eyes get older. That'll certainly be useful.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I mean, when you have a library, a home library, You interact with the books every day. They become a part of your life. You see them, they see you. They remind you that you haven't read this, or you'll see a book and you'll pick it up and you'll read a poem or you read a couple of pages. They are interacting with you all the time. Whereas if a screen, all that stuff is just lying in the memory there for the most part, except for whatever you're actively reading. I like the ambiance of books. It pleases me. I wish they didn't have quite as much of a mess in the basement. The living room and the main rooms of the house are fine.
So what you have is a bookshelf as a vessel for serendipity.
Well, serendipity to some degree. I mean, the bookshelves are organized in a way. I mean, actually, all the books, I have lots of bookshelves in my living room, and people will sometimes come in and say, have you read all these books? And I say, well, almost none of them. Because I keep the books I haven't read in my living room to remind me that I should read them. The books I have read, they tend to go in boxes and end up in the basement, usually because I've accumulated all the books by such and such an author, and then I'll write something about him or her, and then they'll be put away because it'll be a while before I want to go back to them again.
We're almost run out of time. I want to talk about one other thing. You won an Edgar Award this year. Yeah. For the book on Conan Doyle, if we're talking about writing about an author after having read everything. How did that book become, and why Doyle?
Princeton has a series, Princeton University Press, called Writers on Writers. And they have these really pretty little books. They're essentially 225-page essays. They asked me if I wanted to do one, and I suggested a number of very high-minded writers that interested me. Stendhal, who was the subject of a dissertation of mine long ago, Montaigne. Then I mentioned that I was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, the famous Sherlock Holmes group that started in the 1930s.
Of course.
From that moment, they said, okay, Conan Doyle's it. The book is very personal and very much like those blogs you were describing at the American Scholar in tone, but I pack a lot of information in it about Conan Doyle's life, about the Sherlock Holmes stories, but also about the Baker Street Irregulars, and about all these other books that Conan Doyle wrote that have been somewhat overshadowed by, the sleuth of Baker Street. And basically, as in all the books I've done, Classics for Pleasure, or Bound to Please, or readings, or book by book, or an open book. My goal is to write about books with affection and enthusiasm, and in the hopes that other people want to go out there and try some of these books, give them a whirl, and then I write for my, as all writers, you write for yourself. You want something to be pleasing, and you try to achieve some sort of a shape and form to it. But when I was a kid, I grew up in a very working class town. Nobody read books in my family. My father hadn't gone to high, just hadn't graduated from high school. But for some reason, I wanted to learn everything, and it seemed to me that the book was the vessel for learning things. I had these Faustian ambitions, and I still have them. On my way here to this convention, I stopped in a couple exits down the road here at the Wonder Book and Video in Gaithersburg, and bought 3 issues of Armchair Detective. I bought a Tauchnitz edition of Jerome K. Jerome, and also a book on the profession of authorship during the Elizabethan era. All kinds of weird things that I thought I would like to know something about.
So as you continue on this unending journey to read everything ever written, we have run out of time.
Oh,
Michael, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Tom.
And please keep telling us about what you find, because most of us don't have the dedication you have when it comes to the search.
Well, it's not dedication, it's all pleasure.
And on that note, we say goodbye to you, our audience. We hope you found something of interest. We hope you'll come see us again. Until then, this is Tom Schad saying, take care.